The crystal chandelier in Uncle Richard's dining room cost more than most people's cars. I knew because I'd paid for it along with everything else in his Greenwich estate. The Italian marble floors, the sub-zero wine cellar, the Olympic-sized pool that glowed turquoise through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Alex, pass the salt," my cousin Victoria said without looking at me. She was too busy showing off her new Cartier bracelet to Aunt Margaret. "Actually, never mind. I'll get it myself. Wouldn't want you to strain yourself." The table laughed. Even my grandmother chuckled from her seat at the head of the table. I was 32 years old and my family treated me like I was 12. "How's the file clerk job going, Alex?" Uncle Richard asked, swirling his $400 bottle of wine from the cellar I'd funded. "Still shuffling papers at that little company?" "It's going well," I said quietly, checking my phone under the table. My portfolio manager had sent the quarterly reports. Returns were up 41% this quarter. My offshore holdings had cleared $340 million. The cryptocurrency investments had tripled. But they thought I was a file clerk. "Well, at least you're employed," Aunt Margaret said charitably. "Not everyone can be as successful as Richard and Victoria. Some people are just simpler. I'd graduated summa cum laude from MIT with dual degrees in computer science and applied mathematics. I'd built an algorithmic trading platform that generated $50 million in its first year. I currently managed $890 million in assets across 12 countries. But sure, simpler." Speaking of success, Uncle Richard announced, standing with his wine glass, "I'm proud to share that we've just closed on the Nantucket property. $6 million, oceanfront, 12 bedrooms. An absolute steal." Applause around the table. Victoria squealed with delight. What they didn't know was that I'd been the seller. I'd purchased the property 2 years ago for $4.2 million, made strategic improvements, and sold it to my uncle through a shell company for exactly $6 million. He thought he'd negotiated brilliantly. I'd made a $1.8 million profit while he'd overpaid for a property that needed foundation work he hadn't noticed. "That's wonderful, Richard," Grandmother said. "You've always had such a keen eye for real estate." Uncle Richard had declared bankruptcy twice. The only reason he had any assets at all was because of the family trust fund he thought his father had established before dying. His father had left him nothing. I'd created the trust fund 5 years ago, after discovering that my uncle's reckless spending had put my grandmother's care at risk. I'd been quietly funding their lifestyle ever since, letting them believe they were living off inheritance. "Alex, maybe Richard can give you some investment advice," my cousin Brandon suggested. "Help you build some wealth for your future." "I'm managing okay," I said. "Managing?" Victoria laughed. "Is that what you call living in that tiny apartment in Brooklyn? Alex, you're 32. Don't you want more?" My tiny apartment was a 3,500 square foot penthouse in Dumbo with panoramic views of Manhattan. I'd purchased the entire floor of the building, but I'd never corrected their assumption that I rented a studio somewhere. "I'm comfortable," I said. "Comfortable." Uncle Richard shook his head sadly. "That's the problem with your generation. No ambition. Content with mediocrity." My phone buzzed. A message from Klaus Reinhardt, my private banker in Zurich. "Urgent. Trace the irregularities you flagged. Call when you can. This is serious." I'd asked Klaus to run a forensic audit 3 months ago. Something had felt off about my uncle's spending patterns. The trust fund I'd established provided $75,000 monthly. Generous, but not enough to support the lifestyle I was witnessing. Yet somehow Uncle Richard had purchased 2 new Mercedes, a boat, and now a $6 million Nantucket property. "Excuse me," I said, standing. "I need to take this call." "Always working," Aunt Margaret sighed. "Even file clerks don't get evenings off anymore." I stepped onto the terrace, the November air cold against my face. "Klaus, talk to me." "Alex." Klaus's Swiss accent was crisp and professional. "Your uncle has been embezzling from the trust fund. Systematically for 18 months. He's created false documentation, forged authorization signatures, and diverted approximately $4.3 million to his personal accounts." I felt my stomach drop. "How?" "He somehow gained access to the trust documents. Discovered you're the benefactor, not his deceased father. Rather than confront you, he created a parallel structure, using your identity to authorize additional distributions. The bank that manages the operational accounts never questioned it because the documentation appeared legitimate. 4.3 million, I repeated. Plus the regular distributions you authorized. He's been receiving approximately $150,000 monthly total. All while letting you believe he was living within the $75,000 allowance. Through the window I could see Uncle Richard holding court, gesturing grandly with his wine glass, telling some story that had everyone laughing. "Send me everything," I said. "Every document, every transaction, every forged signature." "Already done. Alex, this is criminal fraud. Wire fraud, identity theft, embezzlement. You should involve authorities." "Not yet," I said. "I need to handle this my way." I stayed on the terrace for another 10 minutes, reading through Klaus's documentation on my phone. The evidence was damning. Uncle Richard had been careful but not careful enough. Every fraudulent transaction was documented, time-stamped, traceable. When I returned to the dining room, dessert had been served. Crème brûlée, made by the private chef Uncle Richard had hired last month. "Alex," grandmother called out. "Come sit. Richard was just telling us about his investment strategies. You should take notes." I sat pulling out my iPad. "Actually, I'd love to hear this." Uncle Richard looked pleased. "Well, it's all about diversification. Multiple income streams. I've got the trust fund providing base income, my consulting fees." "What consulting?" I asked mildly. He waved dismissively. "Various projects. The point is you can't rely on a single source. That's poor financial planning." "Interesting," I said, making notes. "So you recommend having multiple accounts? Different banks?" "Absolutely. Spread the risk. I personally use 5 different institutions." "And you track all the transactions? Make sure everything's legitimate." "Of course. Financial discipline is crucial." He leaned back, warming to his subject. "That's what separates people like us from people like you, Alex. No offense, but you've never had to manage serious money. It requires sophistication." "You're right," I agreed. "I should learn from you. In fact, why don't we do this? I'll show you my portfolio, you show me yours. We can compare strategies." Uncle Richard's smile faltered slightly. "Well, I don't like to discuss specific numbers." "Why not? We're family." I pulled up my phone. "Klaus, you still there?" "Yes, Alex." "Can you patch in on speaker? I want to introduce you to my uncle." I placed the phone on the table. Klaus's voice came through clearly. "Good evening. I'm Klaus Reinhardt, Senior Private Wealth Manager at Bank Reinhardt in Zurich. I've been managing Alex's portfolio for 6 years." The table went silent. "Alex's portfolio?" Victoria's voice was small. "Yes. Currently valued at approximately $890 million across various asset classes. Alex is one of our most successful clients." Uncle Richard had gone pale. $890 million, Klaus confirmed. "Though that number fluctuates daily based on market conditions. The algorithmic trading platform alone generates approximately $4 million monthly." Aunt Margaret's fork clattered to her plate. "However," Klaus continued, "I'm calling regarding a more serious matter." "Alex, shall I proceed?" "Please," I said calmly. "We've completed the forensic audit you requested. Over the past 18 months, Richard Pemberton has embezzled $4.3 million from the family trust fund you established. He created fraudulent documentation, forged authorization signatures, and systematically diverted funds to his personal accounts." "That's insane." Uncle Richard stood abruptly. "I don't know what this is, but—" "The Nantucket property," Klaus said. "Purchased for $6 million last week. Down payment of $2.4 million came from the trust fund via unauthorized transfer on October 15th. The Mercedes vehicles, purchased in July, $340,000 total, also from embezzled funds. The boat." "Stop," Uncle Richard's voice cracked. "This is a misunderstanding." "It's documented fraud," Klaus said flatly. "We have every forged signature, every fraudulent authorization, every illegal transfer. The evidence has been compiled for law enforcement review." I stood slowly looking at my uncle. "For 5 years I've been funding your lifestyle. I created the trust fund because grandmother needed care and you'd bankrupted yourself. I gave you $75,000 monthly because I wanted you to live comfortably. Alex, he started. And you repaid me by stealing an additional $4.3 million. While calling me the poor cousin. While mocking my simple job and my tiny apartment. While giving me investment advice like I was some charity case you were humoring. I didn't know it was you. Uncle Richard said desperately. I thought the trust fund was from my father. So that makes the theft acceptable? I looked around the table. You all thought I was nobody. A file clerk living in poverty while you lived in luxury. Did any of you ever ask what I actually did for work? Did anyone care? Silence. I run a quantitative hedge fund, I said. I built an algorithmic trading platform that revolutionized high-frequency trading in emerging markets. I manage nearly $1 billion in assets. I own properties in 6 countries. And I've been supporting all of you, willingly, because you're family. Grandmother was staring at me like I was a stranger. Alex, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us? Because I wanted to see if you'd treat me with respect without the money. Turns out you wouldn't. For 5 years you've called me poor, simple, struggling. Never once asking who I actually was. Victoria was crying quietly. Brandon looked sick. The trust fund is dissolved as of tonight, I continued. The monthly distributions stop immediately. The property in Nantucket. Uncle Richard, you should know the foundation has significant issues. You've got about 3 years before it needs $800,000 in repairs. Hope you budgeted for that. Alex, please, Aunt Margaret begged. We didn't know. You didn't care to know. There's a difference. I gathered my things. Klaus, file the criminal complaint. Full documentation to the FBI, Wire Fraud Division. Wait. Uncle Richard grabbed my arm. Don't do this. I'll pay it back. Every penny. Please, Alex, don't destroy my life over this. I looked at his hand on my arm, then at his face. You stole $4.3 million from me while calling me the family failure. While mocking my career and my life. While making me feel small at every family dinner. And now you want mercy? I'm sorry. God, Alex, I'm so sorry. We all are. Klaus, I said into the phone. What are the sentencing guidelines for wire fraud of this amount? Federal guidelines suggest 10 to 15 years, Klaus replied. Plus restitution, fines, and asset forfeiture. Uncle Richard was openly crying now. Please. I'll do anything. Don't send me to prison. I considered him. This man who'd made me feel worthless for years. Who'd stolen millions while calling me poor. Who'd never once asked about my life, my work, my dreams. I'll give you one option, I said finally. Full restitution. $4.3 million returned within 90 days. Public admission of the fraud to the entire family. Complete disclosure of how you spent the money. And you never ever contact me again for financial help. How am I supposed to get $4.3 million in 90 days? He whispered. The Nantucket property. The boat. The Mercedes. The wine collection. The art. Sell it all. Liquidate everything. Move to a normal house, live a normal life, and maybe learn what it's like to actually earn what you have. And if I can't get it all? Then Klaus files the criminal complaint and you go to prison. Your choice. I turned to the rest of the family. Anyone else been accessing the trust fund? Anyone else want to confess now before Klaus's audit finds it? Heads shook frantically. Good. Then we're done here. I looked at grandmother. I'll still cover your care. Medical bills, living expenses, whatever you need. But the rest of you are on your own. Alex, sweetheart, grandmother said softly. I'm so sorry. We treated you terribly. Yes, I agreed. You did. I walked out of the mansion I'd paid for, and didn't look back. Klaus called as I reached my car. That was intense. Necessary, I corrected. Will he make restitution? He'll try. The Nantucket property alone should cover $3 million. He'll scramble for the rest. If not. I shrugged. Then he faces consequences. And your relationship with them? There isn't one. Not anymore. I started the car, the engine purring. They showed me who they were, Klaus. I just finally decided to believe them. 90 days later, Uncle Richard made his final restitution payment. $4.3 million transferred back to my accounts. He'd sold everything. the Nantucket property at a loss, the boats, the cars, the art collection. He and Aunt Margaret had moved to a modest 3-bedroom house in Connecticut. He'd sent a letter with the final payment. "I'm sorry. I know it doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry. You deserved better from all of us." I filed the letter away without responding. Victoria called a few times. So did Brandon. Even grandmother reached out, asking if we could rebuild our relationship. I ignored most of it. Responded to grandmother's medical needs when they arose. Sent her flowers on her birthday. But the family dinners were over. The poor cousin had turned out to be the family fortune. And he'd decided that fortune was better spent on people who'd earned it. Not people who'd stolen it while calling him simple. My phone buzzed with a notification. Portfolio update. $934 million. Up another $44 million this quarter. I smiled and drove toward my Brooklyn penthouse. The tiny apartment they'd never bothered to visit. Where nobody called me poor and nobody called me simple. Where I was exactly who I'd always been. Just wealthier, wiser, and finally free.